One of the most, if not the most glorious period in our history was the time of the Jewish nation when we had a temple, a Beis Hamikdash. The scene in the courtyard must have been fabulous. Kohanim, the priests, from the age of 25 to the age of 60, dressed in white with a white turban, a colored band around them, barefoot, would run across the courtyard doing the service every single day from sunrise until sunset. One particular Kohen, called the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would come out wearing 8 garments, which included a breastplate, a special apron, a different turban that he wore, and he wore a special garb which he had. It's interesting, the commentators explain that they once sent 2 Roman vassals, ambassadors to Jerusalem to see the service on the 14th of Nisan, before Pesach, of the Korban Pesach, and they saw all that happened, and they saw the high priest coming out, and they converted. They were so impressed, they were so taken by the view of looking at the high priest as he came out and did his service. Imagine a father and a son watching the courtyard, and you could come up. There was a special area where you could watch the service every single day. Imagine it was a very windy, rainy day on Har HaBayis, on the Temple Mount, and there in the courtyard there was a very large altar called the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, the bronze altar, which the flame and the smoke which went up was never ever moved. A miracle. It can be a windy day, but the column of smoke went up straight. The meat, there were thousands and thousands of pieces of meat. There were never any flies, which were found in the slaughterhouse on the temple. No meat ever went putrid, ever went off. Every single morning, the priests would come out with a tray of the earthenware vessels, which were used the day before, and they would drop them on the floor, and they were absorbed inside the floor. These were miracles which took place. It was quite a sight to see. We don't have that anymore. This closeness, this intimacy between the Jewish nation and the Almighty was described in the Talmud by being like a ben hasoymech al shulchan oviv, like a son who would sit at his father's table. A beautiful imagery. Perhaps we can give a parable to describing what that imagery really means. Imagine a student who's studying in a yeshiva in Jerusalem, comes from America, and when he leaves in September, his father gives him an allowance which is supposed to last until Pesach, when he comes home. And he has a good time, and he goes out for a few evening meals, and by the time it comes to a month later, already after Sukkot, he's not a penny to his name. He doesn't know what to do. He can't possibly call up his father and ask for more money. He doesn't know what the mood will be like in the kitchen. He doesn't know. Just to say, Dad, send some more money, I'm broke. He can't do that. But he's a clever guy. He's a smart guy. He decides, I'll do the following. What I'll do is, I'll borrow money until Pesach, which is a few months, and then when I go home, I know if I sit and have a meal with Dad at the table, and he looks at me and I look at him, it's probably much better for me and easier to ask for more money then than it is by an email or calling up or writing a letter, because I have no idea what the mood is like. When father and son are sitting together and they're looking at each other, and there is a warmth, there is an intimacy and a connection, that's what it was like in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, like a father and son sitting together. The Almighty took his share of the sacrifices which were burnt on the altar, and we took our share. And the warmth, the affection, was like a father and a son sitting together. It's interesting, even Haman knew exactly what went on of the great connection of the Almighty with his people when it came to the temple. If you remember in the Megillas Esther, where it's recorded that Haman wrote a letter to all his cronies and all his colleagues around the world to join him in his plan of a final solution of the Jewish nation, he described, it was a very distorted picture of the history of the Jewish nation. He describes how Pharaoh was so kind by bringing the Jewish nation into the land of Egypt, and then they robbed him of all his silver and gold after being guests in his land. A distortion of history throughout the whole period. But one particular line, which I think is a line of truth in this letter, which you can find in the Medrash, in the 7th chapter in the Medrash in Megillas Esther, that he turns around and says in the letter that King Solomon built a temple. And I do not know what happened in there, but whenever the Jewish nation had a problem, they would go in there, do some sort of sorcery and witchcraft, and come out and conquer the world. Meaning, even Haman knew what was behind that structure, the warmth, the closeness, the connection, the father and son connection between the two. And coming certainly into the temple 3 times a year, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, a person would walk through the courtyard, and the Gemara describes exactly what the purpose was of walking through. The priests, the Kohanim, would open up all the curtains, and as you walk through, you could see right through into the Holy of Holies, and the 2 angel-like figures, they were called Keruvim, would be embracing each other. And the Kohanim would say, see, this is the extent of your connection with the Almighty. Ani ledoidi v'doidi li. I am for my beloved, and my beloved is for me. The warmth, the intimacy, that's what we enjoyed in the time of the temple. The 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, we mourn this period of separation. The Almighty left town. He left his people. We were separated from each other. We mourn this separation and pray for a reconciliation. That's the purpose of the 3 weeks. We don't have it anymore. We have something else. At the time, around the time of the destruction of the first temple, we moved from the period of prophecy, the later prophets, to the time of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. Now, one of the later prophets was called Hosea. And Hosea promised the people, Uneshalma forim sifsoisenu, that your lips will replace the bulls. Meaning, now that there will not be any temple, now that there will be no Beis HaMikdash, the Jewish nation moved into the period of exile, but it wasn't that they were completely abandoned. What they now had was the period of prayer, which would replace the value of the sacrifices. That's what the prophet said, that your lips will replace the bulls. Now, we have to understand what that means, because inside those 3 words are the enormous treasure which exists in the power of prayer. Let's look a little bit into the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. There were 120 of the most eminent scholars in all of Israel. They were designated to compose a text, which we know as the Siddur, which is to be used morning, afternoon, and evening for prayers, Shabbos and Yom Tov. And they composed a text which was a profound prophecy. I once saw a comment that the great Chassam Sofer once commented and said that even when they were composing their text, they really had no idea of how profound this composition would be, what a prophecy would be. Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, the great student of the Vilna Gaon, explained in his famous work, Nefesh HaChaim, he explained that what exactly this means, that they composed a text which would be active and powerful and dynamic then for all the period and years and different countries of exile that the Jewish nation would go into. In other words, no longer would there be the impact of sacrifices, but the composition of the prayer, like we say, Melech, Oizer, Umoshia, Umogen, Shema, Koleinu, Chus, all the words that we say, especially in Shemona Esrei, and the whole composition of the order of the prayers, is a phenomenal power of prophecy that is relevant in France during the time of the 10th century, in the Middle Ages, even in the 21st century. That's the power of the prophecy. Even though we don't have the sacrifices, the words of the prayer are significant and make the same impact as if we would have sacrifices. The Chofetz Chaim makes a point about this in his commentary called the Biur Halacha. It's in section Kuf Aleph 101 in the Shulchan Aruch. And he explains that they sat and they debated, the men of the Great Assembly, each letter, each word, each choice of words, each phrase, each nuance was discussed and debated to see the greatest possible impact. And inside their composition was a prophecy, as I just said, which lasted all the way through and will last until the times of the Mashiach. And even though, says the Chofetz Chaim, we really don't know the power of the prophecy, it works. It gets there. The prayer arrives at where it should reach. Let me give you an example, perhaps. Maybe you'll say it's a foolish example, but I think it spells it out quite clearly. Supposing you wanted to send a note to the moon, and so you took a large catapult and you projected it and it flipped up. And it would go maybe, 50 feet, 100, I don't know how long. But if you really had sense and you really wanted to get the message there, you would take a trip to Cape Kennedy and put it on a rocket and take it all the way up to the moon. That's the difference between our words, which we might select, and the words of the men of the Great Assembly. The Siddur is like a message in a rocket. It gets there, it arrives. That's the power of the prophecy at the time of the destruction. That's what Hosea meant, that the words reach the point where they have to get, which we don't have sacrifices, but we do have prayer. There's an expression which is used in the Talmud, Devarim she'omdim berumoi shel olam, that the words of prayer are words which stand at the height of the world. What does that mean? What's the impact of that phrase? Let me give you an example. Two people are sitting at the table together, and one turns around to the other and says, they're eating a meal together, and he turns around and says, give me the milk. Doesn't sound so nice, but he wants the milk. Go up a bit. He could say it perhaps, please pass the milk. Go up a bit even more. He could turn around and say, how are you this morning? How's everything? If you finish with the milk, could I have the milk? Go up even more. How are you? Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to help you? I'll take the milk. I mean, you can go right up. You can go from almost like words in a sewer to words of an oasis. You can lift it right up high. It's the power of prayer, because when you say the words Machalkel Chaim B'Chesed, when you say the words of prayer, they're the highest possible words that you can ever say. Devarim sha'imdim beruma shal olam, words that stand at the height of the world. They're phenomenally powerful. They have an incredible impression. They're much more than hello, good morning, how are you? They're much more than, is there anything I can do to help you? They're the highest and most elevated, most spiritually enlightening words that you can ever say in the whole of your lifetime. That's what it means, words which stand at the height of the world. We used to have sacrifices, but now we have Shema Koilenu, Goimel Chasodim Toivim. These words are the highest words we can ever say. That's the effect of let our lips replace the bulls. I once saw an essay from one of the greatest mentors in Europe. His name was Rabbi Yehonason, who was called the Mashgiach of the Meir Yeshiva there in Europe. He once explained that in some capacity, the words of prayer are even greater than the sacrifices themselves. In this way, in the times of the temple, if you wanted to bring a sacrifice, so you had to go to Jerusalem. You couldn't, if you lived in Alaska, you were in trouble. If you lived in Melbourne, you were in trouble. You had to go to Jerusalem. You had to appoint a priest, a kohen, to do the service for you. You had to come at a certain time, after sunset and before sunrise and sunset. There were specific times. You couldn't bring a sacrifices if you had done a transgression which was willful. In Hebrew it's called b'mezid. It wouldn't be acceptable because you can't bring a sacrifice for that. Said Rabbi Yehonason, but the power of a sacrifice is that you can be in an igloo in Alaska. You don't need a kohen, a priest. You can say it yourself, and these words arrive like a sacrifice. That's what the Novi, that's what the prophet Hosea had said. That's the impact of prayer. They have, perhaps in some capacity, of course, when there would be a temple, we would be obliged to bring a sacrifice. But you see, to some degree, there is even a greater power in the power of prayer. You don't need a priest, you can say the words yourself. Perhaps that explains to us why it is when we come to the most awesome and the most revered days of all in the calendar, which are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which mitzvah are we involved with almost every minute of the day? It's prayer. But why? We have a comment of the sages which says that Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that the study of Torah is even greater. It's greater than any other precept that we have. If that's the case, then why don't we all study Torah? Why don't we do acts of charity? There are other mitzvahs. Why is it that the rabbis designated that we should be involved in prayer on this day? You'll say, because we daven on Rosh Hashanah. But why do we daven on Rosh Hashanah? What's the point behind it? Perhaps the answer is given from a comment in the Talmud, in the Masechta Sukkah. And the Gemara explains as follows. Why are the words of prayer compared to a pitchfork? The Gemara explains that the farmer goes down into the field and he sees that the wheat on top is dry and the wheat underneath is wet. So he takes a pitchfork and flips over the wheat. He turns it over. And the word in Hebrew is called an atar, ayin tof reish, a pitchfork. He flips it over. If you remember, there's an expression that when Isaac and Rebekah couldn't have children, the sentence, the verse says, Vaye'eta Yitzchak lenoicha ishtoi. And the translation is that Yitzchak, Isaac, he entreated Hashem. But the word is atar inside it. He turned over the decree that he and his wife originally were not to have children, but then we learned that once they finished praying, Vataha Rivka became pregnant. So we see that there's a power in prayer to flip over a situation. That's a remarkable power. And that's what we have instead of the sacrifices. The ability to switch over a situation from, let's take an example. In Purim, we learn lahashmid, laharog, ula'abed es kol haYehudim, to destroy, to vanquish, to kill, and to destroy every semblance of a Jew, an early day Hitler, an early day final solution. We learn at the end of Megillas Esther, La Yehudim hoysa oira besimcha besosa v'yikor, that the Jews had light and rejoicing and happiness and honor. What happened here? The whole situation flipped over. It was supposed to have been an Auschwitz, and it turned into a Purim. Similarly, we find in Egypt that they cried out, the Almighty heard their prayers, and the situation turned over, and they left Egypt, Hallelu Abdei Hashem, singing Hallel. The situation changed. That's the reason why we are ordered, we are obligated to pray when the Almighty sits and writes our fortune of what's to be for the coming year. The power of prayer switches the decree. It turns it over like the wheat in the field. It changes the situation perhaps from misery and fear into delight and joy. That's the nature of prayer. That's what it means by the pitchfork. That's what we mean perhaps when we say that it's instead of the korbanos, the sacrifices. The word korban comes from the word korev, to be close. There's an ability to be close to the Almighty and change the situation from devastation into a situation of enormous salvation. That's the prophecy of the men of the Great Assembly. That's the ability of prayer inside the Siddur. Perhaps if that point becomes a reality and one recognizes the importance of prayer, maybe perhaps we can change the personality of a person who stands there with his prayer. In the times of the temple, in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, a kohen would mount the altar and do the service in front of the Almighty, whether it was slaughtering the animal or casting the blood on the side of it or offering the animal, whatever the service was inside the temple, and you needed a kohen there, or even a kohen gadol, for example, a high priest on Yom Kippur. Today we have prayer. Perhaps when a person stands and prays Shemona Esrei, he is a virtual kohen on an altar. Because if we understand fully what the Navi, what the prophet Hosea meant, that the power of the lips is greater instead of the power of the bulls, which were offered in the temple as sacrifices. That's what we're talking about when we see the enormous power behind prayer. In the times of the temple, we had the courtyard, and the priests would dart across, and the service was like a son sitting with his father at the table. And the loyalty and the devotion was clear. But nowadays, we're not abandoned. We're not destitute. We have the power of prayer, and that's the composition of the men of the Great Assembly. However, what I'd like to suggest is that one of the greatest problems we have when it comes to prayer is that we don't recognize what we're saying. We don't realize that the words are Devarim ha'omdim b'rum shalaylam, that they stand at the height of the world. And the words have phenomenal impact and impression on the Almighty. I'd like to explain to you an incident that occurred in an American university several years ago. Now, before I explain this incident, I would like to preface it by explaining to you that when I first heard this event that took place, this incident, I didn't believe it. I took the name of the person who it occurred to, and I was in his town on one of my trips to America, and I met him. I sat down with him, and he's extremely a reputable person, no question. And I went through the incident which I had heard, and I checked every one of the facts. Each one is exactly as I'm going to tell you what had happened. It's a remarkable incident, and I think it needs recording as to give some sort of inspiration and encouragement and great enthusiasm. What does it mean to stand in prayer? This is what happened. A student from yeshiva who'd studied, I think, 2 years in Israel, went back to America to study psychiatry. He was in the school and he'd completed, I think, 4 or 5 years in the school. And as he'd finished the course, the university organized a series of alternative medicine for psychiatric cases, for people who needed assistance and guidance. Instead of the conventional form of medicine, they brought in someone who showed the power of herbs, and he gave a series of lectures. They then brought in somebody who was a hypnotist, and he showed the power of how hypnotism can help. And there were different forms of alternative medicine, and at the end, they brought in somebody who was called a woman, a grand witch. And she was to show how sorcery and black magic could also help in a form of remedy, of healing for people with mental disabilities or psychiatric problems. And she was to give 3 lectures. She was known as one of the greatest witches in the area, whatever that means, I have no idea, but in black magic she was very high up in rank. She came into the lecture theatre, and there were about 100, I think he said 150 students sitting in the auditorium, and she came and gave her first lecture, showing how black magic and certain sorcery and spirits, you can bring up the spirits, and she explained what her skills were. She then said to the group of students at the end, and now I would like to show you what my powers are, what I can do. Please raise your hand. Several students raised their hand. She looked at the students, and each one individually for about a minute or two, and then revealed a personal point of information, a personal detail. She had some sort of ability. She revealed something, and it was accurate and it was true. It was a remarkable ability, but she had that ability. He was sitting, this student, in the top left-hand corner of the lecture theatre. And he noticed after the lecture, and this happened also with the end of the second lecture, the same thing, she did the same thing, asked for people to raise their hands, and she could read people. He noticed that every time she spoke, and whenever she asked for volunteers, she always turned to the right-hand. She never faced in his direction. And he thought it was strange. He asked permission from the professor if she would ask for the same response after the third lecture. He asked if no one would put their hand up but him, because he felt that she was avoiding him. For some reason, he had that intuition. Came to the end of the third lecture, and again she asked for volunteers, and no one, as the professor asked, no one should raise their hands, and he was in the corner and he raised his hand. She became very agitated, very frustrated, and she says, "Is there no one else here who's interested? No one's interested in seeing?" And then it was clear she was avoiding him. She wasn't even looking at him. She was looking in the other direction. The professor said, "There is somebody there in the corner over there. You can read him. No one else." And it was clear that she didn't want to look at him. She had no choice. It was extremely tense in the lecture theatre. She turned towards him. She had no choice. 3 things happened. She stared at him. She became white. She vomited and collapsed. It was very dramatic, as you can imagine. They called the medical team in, they revived her, and they asked her, the professor said, what was wrong? He was right. She explained that the first time she came into the lecture theatre, she realized there was somebody in that corner who was disturbing her powers, who was affecting her ability. And then in the last lecture, when she was asked to look at him, she realized it was him. The professor said, "Why, what's wrong with him?" And she turned around and said the following, "No, he's an Orthodox Jew and he prays. I cannot read him." That's what she said. The meaning is obviously quite clear, that there is, which we are not aware of, an aura of holiness. There is a certain atmosphere which we're unaware of, which of course he has Kedusha, he puts on tefillin, he has a holiness to him, which, as we know, the world of black magic is nothing to do with that. It's all, in Hebrew words, it's called tumah, uncleanliness, spiritually unclean. And someone who prays to the Almighty with sincerity and puts on tefillin every day has a different, entirely different spiritual composition to him from anybody else. That's the incident that happened. A year or two after this incident occurred, he came to Israel, and he was brought into the famous Rosh Yeshiva of Ponevezh, Rav Shach. He was asked to tell over the incident. And what I'd like to share with you is what happened, what Rav Shach said. He told the whole incident, and while he was talking, it was clear that Rav Shach was like fidgeting. He was disturbed. He wasn't happy. When he'd finished, Rav Shach turned round and said to him, so that's the story? So he said, yes, Rabbi, remarkable. And Rav Shach turned and said, what are you wasting my time for? What do you want to show me here? Didn't you know? I think that response says it all. He was bewildered that someone who believes in the Almighty, who puts on tefillin, who no doubt, I'm sure, says brachas and keeps Shabbos, he prays every day. He's an entirely different spiritual being. He's unaware of his elevated status. He doesn't know who he is. And that's what shook the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Shach. It's obvious. Someone who is, with sincerity and with devotion, praying to the Almighty every day, has an entirely different aura of holiness to him. He is literally like a son who's sitting at the table with the Almighty in, of course, figurative terms. He's a virtual kohen. He's like a priest who mounts the altar. He's reciting words which are Devarim she'omdim b'ruma shalaylam, words which stand at the height of the world. He is quite distinct, different from every other person. That's the nature of the power of the words. The words lift a person up much more than hello, good morning, how are you? They're right at the top of the world in spiritual terms. It's the power of prayer. That's the meaning of what the prophet Hosea said, that the lips, the service of the lips, will replace the sacrifices. We are unaware in our times of what the power of the sacrifices are, but what we have to be aware of is that the power of prayer, especially as we realize on the days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, are phenomenally powerful. They have the ability to be a pitchfork. They can turn over a situation. That's why we pray. We're not involved in any other mitzvah on these awesome days. They are days of great reckoning. The rabbis suggested and designated for us that on such days, the best you can do is to pray. It can turn over a situation from an Auschwitz into a Purim. There's an ability to turn a woman, a lady who's infertile, into becoming a mother, like Hannah. It can happen like it happened in Egypt. It's a pitchfork. How fortunate we are, how privileged that we have this great ability to stand like virtual priests and pray to the Almighty. That is the nature of prayer, if we can understand and project it from the courtyard all the way into the 21st century. They work. They have an impact. They're valid. The Chassam Sofer said they were unaware of the Manshei Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly, what they were actually doing when they composed these words. Maybe we can then add and say, Tiskabel tzoloi sahain uvu sahain d'chol Yisrael. We say at the end of Kaddish, may all our prayers and our requests be acceptable in front of the Almighty. Thank you.